Good evening. I'd like to call this work session of the Manhattan City Commission together on February 22nd, 2022, so that we're, well, when we start this tape, we'll know what day it was. The first item on the agenda, of course, is always the Pledge of Allegiance, so if you join me in the pledge. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, the first item on the agenda, and the only item, is the 2021 Financial Year in Review update, and that will include the annual revenue and expense summary, debt review, revenue neutral rate, and American Rescue Act, or ARPA, discussion. And to lead us in that, I can tell, is Rena Neal, the Finance Director for the city. Welcome.
Good evening.
Yeah.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners. Tonight we will be presenting the 2021 Year in Review. Rebecca Doling, Budget and Operations Officer, will begin tonight's presentation with an update on how we ended 2021 with our major revenue sources. She will also highlight the general fund revenues and expenditures, cash balances, and walk through a calculation of a potential revenue neutral rate. After Rebecca, I will discuss the city's bond and interest fund debt structure and history, and I will provide an update on the American Recovery Plan Act funds that we have been allocated. Tom Calico, principal with Baker Tilly, the city's financial advisor, is here from Lawrence to provide a technical perspective of what we will discuss today. In particular, he will help provide understanding of the municipal bond market and our current bond rating, as well as best practices regarding municipal finance, and provide updates on ARPA. I want to thank Ron and Jason for their support and guidance in the development of this presentation discussion tonight. They will provide input and feedback throughout the presentation as well. I will now turn it over to Rebecca to go over the first 14 slides.
Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and first get started off with property taxes. As you see here on the slide, this is just for the general fund. We did collect about 98% of our budgeted property taxes for the 2021 year. Very similar happened also for the last 5 years in the general fund. Over that 5-year period, on average, we did collect about 98%. Overall, for the city, for those same time frames, we were looking close to about that same sort of range, about 98% across all city funds in regards to those as well. So that's kind of how we ended 21 in regards to that. I do want to notate here that our 2021 numbers are still preliminary and do have the ability to change. There are a couple of additional transfers that can potentially happen by the end of March, so we'll be able to have final numbers by then. But these should be very, very close to what we're looking at for final. Okay. We'll go ahead and move on to our sales tax. As the first bullet point notes out, that sales tax in the general fund comprised roughly about 28%, so a little over a fourth, a little less than a third of the general fund is right in between that for sales tax. Sales tax overall for 2021, we did collect about 5% over budget for the city overall. This was 12% higher than 2020 and 8% higher than 2019. So sales tax for the 21 year looked really, really well in regards to that. Okay. We'll also look at compensating use. Compensating use is roughly about 5% of the general fund revenues. Very similar to sales tax. We were quite substantially over budget on our sales or on our use tax. 46% for 2021 we were over in terms of budget. That was 24% higher than 2020 and 52% higher than 2019. So compensating use really did jump up in the 2021 year. As you can see on that last bullet point, in the last 3 years, the general fund on average collected about 138% over what was budgeted.
Remind us what is in the compensating use tax?
Compensating use tax is going to be anything that you order online, so not anything that's going to be in a local store or anything that you walk into. It's going to be anything on that
Okay,
online
so it's
purchase.
only online sales tax. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
And I would just add that part of the reason for that being under budgeted was the legislature, actually the Kelly administration made changes to the law in 20 that allowed the start of collection for online sales from to occur in Kansas. And then the legislature amended that in 21 to allow for additional entities that weren't providing that online sales tax to continue. So we had budgeted very conservatively and had already set the 20 budget before that ruling came out. So that's some of that reasoning for over collection.
Okay, thanks.
Franchise fees, it's also another one of our higher revenues for the general fund. It comprises about 10% of the general fund. For the 2021 budget, you'll notice there is a substantial increase between what was actually collected versus what was budgeted. That was done in anticipation that our franchise fees, we were beginning to see a decrease in the prior trend. So we wanted to try and accommodate that, and ended up surprising us on that 21 side being a little bit better than 20s, a little bit better than 19s as well in regards to that. Special liquor tax. Our special liquor tax is divided between 3 funds here at the city. It's going to be the general fund, your special parks and recreation fund, as well as your special alcohol fund. We do receive these distributions quarterly in regards to that. As you'll notate, in 2021, we did receive about a 21% increase from 2020, but we're still down about 11% from that 2019 number. So starting to look better, but not quite to the levels that we've seen prior to the pandemic. Transient guest tax is also another quarterly distribution tax that we receive. This fund in and of itself has disbursements that go to the Chamber Convention and Visitors Bureau, as well as some debt payments that we have for Annenberg and the Conference Center. It did increase compared to 2020, as you can see, about 5%, but was still drastically down from the 2019 timeframe of about 18%. We'll touch just briefly on our utility revenues in regards to how those looked. You will notate that they were both had increases over the 2020 budget as well as the 2019. That is largely in part due to rate increases that were approved for those specific budget years, as well as there were a couple of rate adjustment corrections in regards to that as well for some of those funds as well.
Could you go back to and cover those other items on that, on the utility rate? Because you covered the first one, but.
Yep. So for 2021, we collected about 4% over the budgeted amount for revenues for all 3 of those together. So when I'm talking utilities, I'm talking water, wastewater, and stormwater together collectively. So for all 3 of those, for the 2021 year, it was about 4% over the budgeted amount. In 2020, we did collect about 97% of our revenues, as well as 92% in that 2019 year. Overall, on a 3-year basis, we collect about 98% of revenues for all 3 of those funds
The
comprised
budgeted,
together.
Okay, thank you.
We'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about our main general fund revenue sources here. 78% is comprised of 5 sources that you see on the slide. So you've got property taxes, sales taxes, compensating use, franchise fees, and as well as transfers. All of those we covered minus the transfers prior in regards to how those ended up for the 2021 year. Very similar, there was a 10% increase in sales tax in the general fund compared to the 2020 budget, and 8% compared to 2019. Same thing for compensating use. We talked about compensating use being up quite substantially, 21% increase from 2020 and about 50% compared to the 2019 timeframe. We'll talk a little bit overall as a city. For 2021, the city took in total revenue of about a little over $31.5 million. For 2020, we took in just a little over $30 million. So that had an increase of about $1.4 million over our 2020 revenue. Where's the map? Okay. This goes into a little bit more in detail in regards to what a lot of that additional revenue was for, or what we can largely attribute it to. We did receive a good amount of money for grants coming in our 21 year. We received about $987 for CARES for the airport. $120,000 was for Child Care Aware, that's for recreation programs. And then there was about $195,000 in the general fund for a shuttered venue grant for the Flint Hills Discovery Center. You'll notice here our gap is getting a little bit smaller in regards to what we actually collected versus what we actually budgeted. This year, or for 2021, our budget for revenues was $32,060,064, and we collected about 98% of that. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about cash balances. Later on this evening, there's going to be a little bit more discussion about adequate cash balances for the city of our size, our circumstances that we have, K-State, Fort Riley, the current environment in terms of natural disasters, all that were kind of possible here, not only for the general fund, but for other funds as well. As you can see from the slide, we're getting really, really close into where GFOA has us as a recommended cash balance, so we're getting closer to that line. Okay. These are going to be our cash balances for how they ended up for 2021, as well as kind of a history of where they were for our other property tax funds here. So we'll talk generally overall. Cash balance for all funds in the city ended up being about $50,224,239. In 2020, we had a little over $45 million, which is an increase of about 12% from 2020. So a little over $5 million in terms of our total overall city cash balance. In regards to that, 17% of that total cash balance is the general fund, being close to that $8.6 million. The bond and interest fund comprises about 9% of that. That's roughly around $4.3 million. Utility funds do pick up a big chunk of that. 30% of that is cash balances within those three utility funds. And then the rest of the 44% comes within the rest of our special revenue funds that we have here at the city.
Rebecca, would you go
Yes.
back to that?
Sure.
I think you heard Rebecca talk about that we did only receive 98% of our property tax funds. So obviously we were short. Some of that's due to delinquencies or non-payment. We anticipate if the dark store issues continue to degrade, those shortfalls will continue. Because of that, we did have to make some transfers. We transferred about $167,000 out of our other revenue funds to the Riley County Police Department, and also did other transfers accordingly in a smaller amounts to other areas. So I think you've certainly heard us at budget time indicating we should budget for delinquency, and I think especially with the dark store coming on, we should start doing that. We have been sporadically doing that. We don't necessarily have to do it in every fund, but we should do it in some of the major property tax funds, and the law board is clearly a big fund that's totally dependent on property taxes. So just wanted to point that out.
Can we call it something other than delinquency? I mean,
Property tax shortfall?
I don't know, I'm just saying, that when we talk about delinquency and delinquent we talk about delinquent property taxes to the county. And that is a completely different term. We're just talking about a shortfall or a deficiency in the amount of sale, from what we expected to the amount that's collected.
Well,
it's
what the county collected less and shared with us.
Yeah.
So it is the delinquent funds that the county didn't collect from those who chose not to pay it or couldn't pay it.
Well, it's just not our delinquent fund. Anyway, okay, fine. We all understand what we're talking about. It's a shortfall, a shortage, over which we have no control. And we can ask the county to be more assertive in collecting it, though, too. I mean, in years past, it's really languished. So that, I don't know, I haven't checked lately to see if that's an issue, but could take a look at that. Thank you.
All right, any questions on year-end financials before we kind of jump into the revenue neutral rate discussion?
Well, I just want to say, when you say 2%, about how much is that? If we collected 98%, what is the total, what does 2% equivalent to?
Let's see here. I'll get that for you and let you know in regards to total overall. Like I said, it'll obviously kind of depend because property tax is spread across a wide variety of city funds. So for those, I'll get you that here shortly.
Sure, because it makes a difference if it's 500,000, 200,000, whatever it is, thanks.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and we'll start our discussion on the revenue neutral rate. The revenue neutral rate is going to be your tax rate for the current tax year that would generate the same amount of property tax revenues that you're as levied in the previous year using the current tax year's total assessed valuation. I know that's kind of a mouthful and has a lot going with it, so we'll go ahead and kind of start with an example here. The example on the left is going to be what our 2022 budget was set on. $31 million is what I estimated as the final bill tax revenue that does come from the county. So at this point, it is just an estimate in regards to that. 598 was what our mill valuation was at that time. So you can see 52.143 is what our mills were for the 2022 budget. On the right-hand side, you're still going to take the same amount of estimated final tax revenue, so whatever that is from the county, that's what they'll do. The bottom number I took is a 7% increase in valuation. So you can see with that increase, your mill is now only 48.704. So as your valuation increases, that value of that mill becomes less and less in order to achieve the same amount of property tax. As with the 22 budget, we do anticipate going through that same revenue neutral rate process that we did last year as well. So.
Okay. Just to make a quick math calculation, if it was 31.2 million of tax revenue, 2% would be $624,000. As a ballpark number, for all property taxes, if we didn't collect that 2% of all property taxes, we could guess it'd be 624,036, whatever, of 2% of that 31 million, just to get it within a couple $100,000.
I mean, possibly. I mean, if yeah.
So it's not 200,000, it's not a million, it's approximately 600.
Yeah.
Just, okay.
I mean, off of those rough numbers.
Off those rough numbers, yeah. That's all I was looking, just approximately. Okay.
Correct, yes.
On the revenue neutral rate, I pointed out in the memo that I think it's important to, the way the revenue neutral rate was set up was it focuses on keeping the impact the same, the dollar amount the same, not necessarily the mill levy the same. So if you're planning to capture any new construction at all to help pay for expanding services, then you're automatically going to exceed that revenue neutral rate, which we talked about last year, and that was one of the primary reasons that we wanted to do that. And I pointed out there's over 88 million in new construction in permits that were issued this year. So if you're going to capture that, and those are taxpayers that have never paid taxes. And so even if you're keeping the mill levy the same, with the revenue neutral rate, the legislature requires you to keep the budgeted revenue the same, not the mill levy the same. So the mill levy would actually go down if you were just going to keep the revenue neutral rate. So anyway, that was just something we want to talk about. Obviously, it's a budget issue, and it's something that we need to take into consideration.
I can just comment on that, just like last year, I believe we have to capture the growth. Doesn't make sense not to. So to me, that means, you're going to exceed the revenue neutral rate. It just is. And then the other consideration is, I don't know what the inflation rate's going to end up being, but I think we've got to capture that too. And this revenue neutral rate does not allow for that.
Any other questions on revenue neutral rate or anything? Alrighty. If not, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rena, who's going to start our debt discussion moving forward.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate it.
And thank you, Commissioner Hattasol, for your calculation. I had it pulled up in case we didn't get to that. I will talk to you all about the bond and interest fund and our debt history and debt limit, and then ARPA. The bond and interest fund pays for general obligation debt, as well as city at-large temporary notes and our special assessments for city-owned property in the state of Kansas Transportation Revolving Fund loan. Listed on the screen are the sources of revenue that help pay for that debt. The screen reflects the 2021 budget and how the bond and interest fund compares to the overall budget. The bond and interest fund has 16% of the total city budget, of which 12% of the revenue sources come from property taxes, 26% come from special assessments, and then 19% from transfers from special revenue funds and the utility funds. We also have about 16% budgeted for cash reserves, and then 4% for sales taxes and 3% for miscellaneous revenues. We also include in that calculation our moral obligation for our STAR and TIF funds, which comprises 22% of the budget for the bond and interest fund. This slide reflects our historical cash balances from 2012 to 2021, and we also have them broken out further by restricted and unrestricted. The restricted amount deals with the quality of life sales tax initiative for our pools and our zoo education building, as well as the passenger facility charges for terminal expansion project at the airport for the phase 1 portion of that project. And so those restricted balances are used to pay for that debt. And then unrestricted is the balance. And as you can see, our balance rose from 2012 to 2015 and began to drop down from 2016 to 2020. We ended the year with an unaudited balance of about $360,000 of an increase from 2020 to 2021. If you look at the unrestricted line, our balance has been below $3 million since 2015. And so again, that restricted line is for quality of life and passenger facility revenue that is used to pay for that debt specifically. And that has carried the bond and interest fund for a few years. This next slide talks about our property tax and our mill levy from 2012 to 2021 and aligns with the previous slide in terms of our cash balances. So we had a high of 5.412 in 2013, and then we dropped about 1.5 mils in 2014. And I believe that is just primarily due to, if we go back, those cash balances being so high in 2013, 14, and 15. And we used those cash balances to offset the need for property taxes in those years. We have gradually increased our mill levy since 2015. We did go down in 2017 and have ebbed and flowed that throughout 2018, 19, 20, and now 2021. On average, we have budgeted around $2.5 million in property taxes for the time period, and our mill levy was about 4.7 mils during that period as well. This slide reflects the unaudited preliminary fund balance compared to our budget. These were the actual revenues and expenses that came in for the year, and again, our net change in our balance is $362,000. We began the year at about $4 million, and so we're ending the year a little bit over 4.3. The moral obligation is budgeted, but it's not spent, and so that's reflected in there as well. This next slide talks about our debt in total and all the debt instruments that we have, from our general obligation bonds, our special assessment bonds, general obligation temporary notes, special assessment temporary notes, our special obligation bonds, STAR, TIF, TDD, our lease purchases, our State of Kansas KDHE loan, as well as our State of Kansas KDOT Transportation Revolving Fund loan. So from 2018 to 2021, the total debt rose from $244 million to $322 million, dollars. And the increase is due to the temporary notes. At the end of 2021, we had about $150 million in temporary notes outstanding, and that's related to what we call the Big Five projects, North Campus Corridor, Aggieville improvements, as well as the joint maintenance facility and the levee. And we haven't issued any temporary notes for the airport runway, but we did hear information last week from the airport director about the potential impact to the city for that project. Our total general obligation bonds outstanding have maintained over a little bit over $100 million, and at the end of 2021, it was $109,215,000, and the breakdown between general obligation bonds and special assessment bonds are reflected at the top. Each month, we prepare a debt report, and this is just a snapshot of the debt at the end of 2021, and we have broken down our debt by those various debt instruments that were reflected on the prior screen, and then the potential repayment. So City at Large has a multitude of repayment sources, whether it is property taxes, sales taxes, transfers from special revenue fund or cash reserves. And then we have our utilities that pay for their portion of the debt. Special assessments cover that portion of the debt. And then special obligation, they have their own revenue sources that come in to pay for that portion of the debt. Each time we issue debt, we have to calculate our debt limit, and that is mandated by Kansas Statute 10308. In that statute, we calculate our debt limit based on 30% of our total assessed valuation and our motor vehicle valuation. We get a state-imposed debt limit, and then we back out those items that are not subject to the debt limit, and they are listed on this screen for you. So any of our utility-related debt is not subject to the debt limit. Refunding of our general obligation bonds, we exclude that as well. And then certain street improvements, intersections, and streets that front school district or city property are also excluded. This is our legal debt limit as of December 31st, based on our final assessed valuation from the county in the fall, plus the motor vehicle valuation to get our total assessed valuation, that 30% debt limit ratio, which is mandated by the state. And then this is our state-imposed debt limit of $193 million. If we take into account all of our general obligation bond debt and our temporary note debt is over $250 million. However, only $152 million of that is subject to the debt limit, and that leaves a remaining amount of debt that we can issue subject to the debt limit of about $40 million. Here's our debt limit history from 2018 to 2021. And again, that has increased due to the issuance of the temporary notes for those big projects that I had mentioned. So on this screen, we have information related to our bond rating. We issue debt 4 times a year for temporary notes and bonds at least once a year. And these are the rating factors that are taken into consideration when debt is issued. We are compared to other municipalities of like size, and we have a conversation with our financial advisor as well as the bond rating agency, and then they go to committee to evaluate our portfolio. Our bond rating history over the past 11 years, we used to be rated by 3 entities, and beginning in 2020, we only have begun to be rated by Moody's. We are no longer rated by Fitch and S&P, Standard & Poor. It was decided to not continue to get those ratings. We've saved money on cost of issuance when issuing debt. Plus, there were just concerns with our timeliness of our financial reporting. So we elected to not continue to go out and get ratings for them and just continue with Moody's. We maintained a AA2 rating from 2011 to 2020, and then in 2021, we were downgraded due to various factors that are going to be listed in the next slide.
Rena, what's the next level down? AA4 or B1 or what's the next? If ours was to drop one more spot, what is that number? Is it AA?
I think it's B.
Is it B to drop to a B something?
A1? A1.
Oh, A, no little a, big A only, A1. Okay.
And then B.
So there's three levels at the A, just like there's at the double A. There's A1, A2, A3, and then you get into B. Into the B category.
Thank you. So this slide reflects the reasons for the downgrade, and each time we receive a report from Moody's, they provide an explanation as to why we were rated the way we were. Our rating was downgraded because of our increase in the city's debt burden, and I mentioned that earlier, failure to structurally balance the debt service fund. We have been operating at a deficit in the debt service fund for about 5 years, meaning we spend more than the revenues that we are bringing in. So, and the reason why we're able to do that is the next bullet, the reduction in our operating reserves. So we're using reserves to help balance our debt service fund. Another reason for the downgrade, and something that is not really within our control, but we have a heavy reliance upon sales tax, and because of that ebb and flow with our constituents, that has contracted the local economy. We have K-State and Fort Riley. Anytime there's population changes with them, that also impacts our economy as well. To upgrade the rating, we must have significant reduction in our debt burden, and we will talk about that during our budget process in terms of how we could get to that with the strategy for our bond and interest fund forecast. We would need to either increase our mill levy to generate revenue to capture material growth and operating reserves, and those 2 things are within our purview. And then the last 2 things are external. The local economy will need to strengthen, and the tax base will need to grow. I mentioned earlier the big 5 projects, and I just wanted to go over those with you. Not in detail, but just to let you all know that these 5 projects are at the heart of every discussion that we have internally. And so the information listed on these slides is just reflective of information that has been provided to y'all throughout the course of the projects, whether through the design phase or when projects are bid out. So these cost estimates, the potential funding sources, terms of the debt structure, that's all been presented before. We will continue to review this information with you all as we work through the bond and interest forecast and as we convert the temporary notes to bonds. So for the Aggieville improvements, heavy reliance upon TIF revenues and possible new 2023 sales tax, and we will convert those to GO bonds in 2025. Airport runway, Brandon, the director of airport, referenced this project last week, and we have about a $5.4 million city at large estimate, new 2023 sales tax, and bond and interest fund if necessary, converted to GO bonds in 2028. We haven't issued any debt for this project yet.
Rita, just a further comment on the airport. Some of you will recall we had two phases of the airport terminal building, and Rebecca mentioned the passenger facility charge revenue that we put in place for the first phase of the terminal. We'll need to renew that for the second phase, and that process can start pretty soon. The FAA typically doesn't let you have two of those out at a time, so that one's about run its particular course. As you might guess, in 20 and 21, we had less enplanements because of the pandemic, so it really affected our pandemic revenue. And one of the limitations that there is on both the FAA relief funds we received as well as the ARPA funds is you can't use it to cover debt directly. So there was never going to be enough passenger facility charge revenue to cover the debt service of those terminals. It was always anticipated there would be other bond and interest fund required, most likely property tax, mill levy support. So I'm not saying you have to do that, but I'm just saying there was never a vision of the PFCs ultimately being able to cover the debt service on the new terminal building. So we'll also have that $5.4 million to cover. We've talked about potentially using a portion, even when we were talking about the sales tax renewal for remember the 23 sales tax as a citywide sales tax that's covering debt service as well as infrastructure as well as workforce housing. So when we talk about the 23 sales tax, that's what we're referring to.
Thank you. The next is joint maintenance facility, and there's various funding sources related to the repayment of the debt for this. We will convert those to GO bonds in 2025. The levy improvements, again, surcharge fees will pay for these improvements as well as transfers from other funds that have some impact to this project. Conversion to bonds 2025. There's also the possibility of the 2023 sales tax. And then North Campus Corridor, the various funding sources listed on the screen, plus the 2023 sales tax potentially, and then conversion to bonds 2023 to 2027 due to the various phases that have already begun. Again, we plan to discuss these projects during each budget cycle to ensure the strategy and forecast for the bond and interest fund moves us in a direction of a structurally balanced fund with a healthy cash reserve. The next topic of discussion is ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Last year we discussed waiting until the final rule to begin further discussion of the potential uses for these funds. The final rule was issued in January of this year. The city was allocated $12.7 million. We have received half of that, and our second half will come in May of 2022. Possible uses are listed on the screen. Whatever expenses that are incurred beginning March 3rd, 2021 will need to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and all funds spent by December 31st, 2026. And so we could use those to replace lost public sector revenue, meet and respond to the needs from the pandemic, public health or negative economic impact, and then investing in infrastructure. And again, our allocation. A compliance update, we had to submit our quarterly report by January 31st, submitted it on January 27th. At that time, we elected to calculate the revenue loss. There is a standard allowance with this with this final rule that we can allocate up to $10 million of revenue loss and not have to go through the calculation process. We will make that determination with the April filing if we were go with the actual calculation or just take the standard allowance of $10 million for the revenue loss. Qualifying expenses to date for public health, we did have a vaccine and booster incentive for employees. That was something that was recommended by the federal government for the use of these funds, and we had 151 employees who received that incentive. These uses listed for internal as well as community needs are not set in stone. Again, revenue replacement, we recommend that funds are used for one-time payments or things that do not require a sustainable revenue source. Some of the uses potentially could be the use for our ERP system, implementation of our pay study, some of the results from the pay study, investing in our capital improvement program, establishment of a vehicle and equipment reserve. The next bullet is questionable in terms of establish a bond and interest fund reserve. I know that this is something that has been presented to staff, and we will continue to monitor and review those requests and those uses. And then other growth-related opportunities. Community needs for outside agencies, we would need to, in my opinion, hire a grant administrator to help ensure compliance. We will be dealing with multiple outside agencies, and with our staffing shortages in the finance department as well as the city manager's office, it would be best to get a grant administrator. The funds could be used to pay for that position as well. We could use that money for the implementation of our housing study results, as well as a mini grant application process similar to what we do for SSAB and special alcohol funding. And then anything that is not allocated through those or any other suggestions that come from the community, then those funds would be put aside and could be used from 2022 to 2024. Future outlook.
Rena?
Yes.
Okay, this is Commissioner Reddy. On your previous slide, go back just one more slide. What does it mean for other growth-related opportunities? What does that mean? Is there an example you can provide?
Well, there's a lot of discussion going on in terms of Aggieville as well as downtown, east of town, internal services that are needed. And so anything related that would help capture the growth within the community. So nothing specific at this time, but we would need to continue to evaluate that as we go through each budget cycle. I don't have anything specific.
No specific examples?
ARPA specifically allows for a number of utility-type improvements, some pavement work in specific areas. There's just a variety of other projects where they're more one-time use. Maybe we could do that instead of issuing debt. So there's a number of components that it could be used for.
So for like infrastructure upgrades, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
It can be used for that, okay. Thank you.
So I have a question. You mentioned the up to $10 million for revenue reductions that, I think the way you phrased it, we could take up to that amount with having to provide documentation on.
We would still need to document how we would use the funds. So we would take the standard allowance of $10 million, and then we would need to find eligible uses within the final rule to utilize those funds.
Okay, that was really my question, was that, okay, so you can say, or you say, I lost all this revenue. It's not like then you're free to go ahead and spend it on what you want, so to speak. There's still strings attached to what you can spend it on, even though you've said, hey, I just lost this money and I would have spent it this way.
Yeah, but is it possible, like as John says, I mean, when I look at, all the stormwater projects and sewer projects, they'll eat up that 10 million overnight. So isn't there enough there to justify that?
Yeah, there will be projects, there's other internal uses that the funds could be used for as well, and we would need to continue to review that internally and with you all as we go through the budget. We have not
Okay,
set
so-
any of that in stone. These are just potential uses for the funds.
Okay, but it seems to me that we're gonna easily be able to,
No, I hear what
Justify
you're saying
spending
with
that.
that, which could do it, but my question was more focused on if I showed that I lost this money, do you still have restriction on what I could spend it on? Because if I wouldn't have lost the money, I could have spent it on what I wanted.
So,
Go up to the microphone.
so Tom Calico again with Baker Tilly. So, quick clarification on, with the final rule, the change was made that recipients of fiscal recovery fund awards will have a choice. Thanks. You have a choice. You can elect one of two things. You can elect the $10 million revenue loss standard allowance, or you can elect to calculate your actual revenue loss. It's an either or, it's not up to 10 million, you either elect 10 million. Now, it doesn't increase your award. In your case, you happen to have an award that's over 10 million, so if you elected that, it would be 10 million. But for some other Kansas communities, they might have an award of 3 million, in which case, if they took the $10 million standard allowance, basically, it would only apply to the 3 million. It doesn't increase their award. Any amount that that is deemed revenue loss under the final rule may be spent on the provision of government services. The provision of government services is a very broadly defined expenditure category. It basically is, as the name would imply, anything that you would typically spend money on. It is only subject to the overarching restrictions on all fiscal recovery funds, which are you can't pay debt service, you can't put it into a reserve fund, you can't make extraordinary deposits into pension funds, and you can't pay legal judgments and settlements. That applies all over. But you can spend it, as I said, on anything that is considered the provision of government services. Very broad category.
I know this was a lot of information that we went over this evening, but these are hot topic areas, things that we need to continue to watch and pay attention to this budget cycle as well as future budgets. As Rebecca mentioned, we will continue to monitor the valuation to determine the revenue neutral rate. It was discussed tonight to capture the growth in valuation. We would need to exceed the revenue neutral rate to support city services. So that is something what we will continue to monitor. We will continue to discuss ARPA and the potential uses throughout the budget cycle and future budget cycles. We anticipate an application process similar to the process we use to allocate SSAB and special alcohol funds to determine community needs. It is extremely important for us to create strategies that focus on creating sustainable revenue sources and building our cash reserves. This is something that will be reviewed each time we issue debt. The amount of debt we have coupled with low cash reserves presents a huge challenge for us. We pay on average about $15 million in GO debt each year, and of that 12% comes from property taxes to pay that debt. We have begun working on a bond and interest fund strategy that aims to address these challenges and will increase the cash reserves balance. Rebecca mentioned that we're close to our $9 million reserve balance in the general fund. In the previous slide, we will need to continue to increase that. When we have a reserve balance, we want to maintain that. If we dip into that, we will need to find a way to replenish those. And those funds really should be used for emergency needs. We plan to have future conversations about the city's finances and the development of strategies to fund our capital improvement program, which is in alignment with our new strategic plan. Finally, we plan to present multi-year financial forecasts, which is a recommended GFOA, Government Finance Officer Association best practice that will be incorporated in future discussions throughout the year. We are hopeful these conversations and strategies will be able to move us in a positive directions towards sustainable future funding obligations. We thank you for your time and we welcome any questions and feedback regarding this presentation.
Rena, so help me understand,
we've got a gazillion dollars worth of temp notes. So is, with temp notes, are we normally just paying the interest for the year or two until we bond them? Or are we sometimes paying them down before we bond them? Start with that question.
Okay, so with our temporary notes, we have about $150 million of temporary notes. About 13 million or so of that is dedicated to cash payments. A lot of that is related to our new quality of life sales tax for our recreation facilities. And so we are paying down temporary notes on that over 4 years. The remaining is special assessments, which is about another $13 to $15 million. And those will bond when the temp notes mature, and they'll be paid over 20 years. And then the other projects are stormwater, water, wastewater. There may be some street projects in there. And that is about, I can't give you the number, but I do know the Big Five or Big Four as of now is about 90 million of that amount. And so we don't have the strategy yet as to how we would actually pay for those. We could use some of that new sales tax money to pay down the debt. We'll have other financing sources coming in. So if we go to, let's see, North Campus Corridor, we're getting money from City University, Economic Development, KSU Athletics throughout this time frame. So those funds could be used to pay down the project prior to us bonding, or we can make transfers into the bond and interest fund to offset that debt.
Okay. It seems like whenever we do bonding, there's like you're always figuring another, 10, 15% for closing costs, for lack of a better term. Do temp notes have that big sort of upfront, get started fee like the bonding does between paying Baker Tilly and everybody else to do all their work? It seems like we talk about, in order to get $37 million, we've got to do a $40 million bond because there's so many sort of upfront expenses. Are temp notes,
Yes.
is there less of that expense involved? Quite a
So-
bit less or a little bit less?
Temporary notes, they do have cost of issuance fees as well as underwriter's discount included in the calculation. And then when it's converted to bonds, it includes the interest. So the question of paying the interest is paid throughout the term of the temporary note until we bond. It's paid from the project account. So all of those costs are added together, plus the design and the construction, any right-of-way acquisition, things like that, and then that's the total amount to bond. The higher your bond amount, the lower your bond and discount fee would be. So our max is 3.5%. So on a bond issue, for example, our May 2022 bond issue right now, we just have our special assessments about $1.3 million to capture the fees of cost of issuance. We would need to have a 3.5% bond and discount fee to be able to pay our financial advisor, our bond counsel, and the others that we pay related to issuing that.
Commissioner, just to add a little bit, give you an example. We recently awarded North Manhattan Avenue, $6.5 million project. When we came to you, we got a bond resolution for just over $7 million. That roughly $500,000 covers a lot of what you're referring to as cost and closing costs and additional contingency. So the temporary note phase of any project, that 3.5 years, we sell those notes for typically 1 to 1.5%. And that's what you're going to pay annually for that 3.5 year period before you bond.
Okay.
When you bond, you obviously incorporate then financial advisors, bond counsel, and a variety of other expenses that Rena just highlighted. So we have two different processes. And that's why we can sit here today and say, of the big five, we have paid no dollars in bond cost yet.
Yeah, okay.
And that's why it was so important to get the 0.5 out there for a vote, and leadership here got it on the ballot, it passed. Now you have a $6.5 million revenue stream for the next 10 years at no inflation, no increase whatsoever in sales tax. That's the $65 million we keep referring to help assist with Aggieville, North Campus Corridor, and the other ventures that we spoke of. The key thing about those big five, I mean, it's coming. We have been active,
Yeah.
but it has not hit the bond and interest fund from a debt service perspective yet. We have yet to really pay on these projects. They will start, and Rena highlighted, 25, 26, 27, 28. They're forthcoming. Fortunately, we'll also have revenue coming in as well, not only from the sales tax, but from a lot of other items. That's how Aggieville is so important as we facilitate growth on our parking lots to create value. I just checked today, the Marriott is valued at over $17 million in Aggieville. We anticipated 8. So there are things like that that are occurring that will only help our forecast that we previously showed you half the amount coming in annually. It'll be almost double. Now, I wish I could say that for everything we give you in terms of a forecast, but I would also venture to tell you when we work with RENA in issuing debt, we run it through a model and we do show it running out for a 10, 15, 20-year period at 4% plus. We haven't issued 4% debt in a long time, but we do build it conservatively. The biggest thing, I guess, the takeaway for this evening is understanding the downgrading, but also understanding how to get that balance in that bond and interest fund back up. And we've met internally, and I think we have a really strong strategy we'd like to share in future meetings, but this evening was really just more about this is where you're at. And this is why the rating agencies downgraded us, and this is where we really need to pay attention and have a focus. The big five, the 0.5 sales tax starting in 23 are going to be an enormous boost to the big five. It's going to help tremendously. But we need to watch this fund diligently moving forward and use those revenues appropriately and build a balance in that bond and interest fund so we're not so subjective to downgradings, which ultimately would hurt long-term debt approach.
So a $4 or $5 million balance in the bond and interest fund is okay. It's not okay, but it's not terrible now. But if we have an extra $100 million worth of bonds, that balance is going to have to be 10 or 12 million bucks for them to feel the same way they do about our $4 million balance on how much debt we have now.
And I'm glad you brought that back up, Rena. You know, I asked Rena the question flat out. What do we need? 10 million is what we need of unrestricted. Right now we have 2.8. That restricted is going to flow in and out. The unrestricted is really the balance. And if we had 10 million in unrestricted, no different than the 8.5 we have in the general fund cash balance right now. It's where you need to be. It's where GFOA tells you need to be, which we were so far away from for so many years. But the bond and interest cash balance needs to be about 10. And we have a strategy to get there. And I recognize the strategies going forward are always going to be debated and centered around where mill levies go. And we've developed some strategies moving forward in the general fund and in the bond and interest fund with very minimal property tax impact. Because we know, if anything we've learned the last 6 years, that is a very difficult thing to get done. But we have to internally create some discipline and a commitment towards this and not let those revenues be used for something else. We also internally, for the general fund, are dedicated to being lean and adjusting ourselves accordingly and living within our means, but also paying our people. And again, that mill levy, we know we can't just come flop it on the table and say we need more mills. We're going to be adjusting. We have been adjusting. And we're going to continue to do that. But it will have impacts. But we understand that's the writing on the wall. That's where we need to head.
So when you talk about, so if you're looking for 10 million for the bond and interest fund, So what kind of, so compare, if we have, yeah, 4.3 million in the bond and interest fund. General fund, what's that magic number there you'd kind of like to see? There's, because they're talking about two different
It is two
cash
different funds.
balances.
8.5 million
Okay,
in the general fund for a cash balance.
okay,
We have 8.7 today. We're in good shape there.
okay. So overall, but just the bond and interest part is the thing.
And the reason we're in good shape is the federal government dropped $4 million in CARES in our lap, and that's where it's at right now.
Okay, so it's not like we've sort of accumulated that through savings and
We-
sales tax
We did.
bonuses?
We did.
Yeah.
We did, just not the full 0.85 million.
Not the whole thing.
Absolutely. We absolutely contributed towards that balance. You can't get away from the 4 million in CARES that's come in unrestricted, and that's sitting in that general fund right now.
Okay.
The bond and interest cash balance is a different story, and that's really where our attention needs to go.
The, so Tom said that we really can't use the ARPA money to prop up cash balances and fire reserve and stuff, or,
Not directly, and that's why, I mean, we want more time, and with the majority of that money still sitting in municipality coffers across the country, it needs to be loosened up. There are ways to document that money of past expenditures that would qualify. We need to keep working through that. You see city after city after city talk about using it the way they need to use it after they document. That lost revenue scenario of $10 million, we can start documenting, we just have to submit it. There are expenditures that we made that are qualified. We need to document those. It'll then, hypothetically, free up that cash so we can be more discretionary with it.
well, because, yeah, I'd like to, see us, put a bunch of that someplace, like, some of it, a few million to the bond and interest fund, and then,
We're with you.
Yeah.
And we'll bring back those strategies,
So,
Commissioner.
yeah,
Yep.
'cause- and I don't know what the magic number, do we have to, on the community part where I know, like, is there a certain percentage that sort of has to be earmarked for community things like emergency shelter, crisis centers, places, things like that, or that's just whatever amount we earmark ourselves?
So there's not. And you're not required to go through a process, but we're recommending that you do. We think since we're going into a budget process, that's the more reasonable time when we're already asking folks for capital improvement suggestions. We're asking folks to submit budget requests for various things. We would add a similar provision for ARPA needs. You might recall that we've still got unspent CDBG funds that have been available. There's a lot more documentation to that sort of thing. There will still be requirements for documentation depending on the expenditure limit for anybody that we provide ARPA funds to. They'll have to document how they're using it, and it needs to be CARES eligible. So we haven't received a lot of interest in that, but there are areas where we know we've been short. So we've been short in special alcohol, and oh, by the way, even before COVID, you got about twice as much request for money than the money you appropriated, because we didn't have the extra. That's been somewhat true in social services. The last 2 years, they've provided you, if there were additional funds, this is how some of the need could be met. So we know there's likely some need out there. At the same time, a lot of those local agencies have had a number of other sources that they could reach out to. County's got some funds. The state's out with a lot of funds. The feds have a number of different programs that they're issuing funds directly for that are all targeted to, there's a lot of duplication in a lot of those. They're all targeting some of the same things. So it's who do you want to do business with type of thing. And we're looking at those as well. I mean, we think there's a way, the new infrastructure bill that came out could help us a lot on some of our big five. And so we're looking at those as well to be able to stretch and be able to help invest some of our local funds the same way. So the good news is we've officially got till the end of '24 to allocate it and '26 to spend it, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's this bill in the House currently that was a bipartisan bill that passed the Senate that extends that, I think, another 2 years in each of those categories and frees up additional flexibility as it's currently written. So if that passes, more to come. So that's why we haven't been in a huge hurry. One, there hasn't been a lot of requests. And then just got the final rule last month. Other things are pending that could influence even that final rule. So as we develop, we think the best way to proceed is through our normal budget process and provide input for our internal use that way, as well as seeking information from the community for what those additional needs might be that have been unmet.
You should go ahead.
Okay, so some of the questions Mark had already asked. I was wondering, when we look at the restricted funds, we've never really had, since 2015, we've had about 2.9 million at best. So it's been in that range, so it's not to say like that just decreased recently. But for the restricted ones, those are our sales tax funds, right?
Sales tax and passenger facility charge revenue
Okay,
for the terminal expansion Phase 1 project.
so from 2023, our restricted ones will increase by 6 million?
So the restricted amount will increase by whatever revenue is brought in each year to help pay the debt. So if,
Okay. So if we collect from the sales tax, how much would go into restricted and how much would go into unrestricted? Or would that go in here at all?
And this is part of the strategy we want to talk to you all about on the approach with the bond and interest and the Big Five. Part of that strategy is capturing that revenue, allocating it back towards the Big Five and how it would support those in the out years. As we mentioned, a lot of that debt won't come on until 26, 27, 28. So in looking at our forecast, 27 and 28 are significant. We're more in line with where Mark was headed with getting a balance in here from potentially federal sources than tapping into the 0.5. The 0.5 is going to be needed in 27, 28, and 29. If we can peel it off and dedicate it towards those 5 areas, then when that debt is due, make that payment, we will have used the money as it was intended, not to prop up this fund, but to pay for those projects. We can prop up this fund and dedicate an effort and an energy towards it, but that $6 million won't just land in the bond and interest fund. We would rather not do that. It gives an artificial sense of where you're at, knowing it's going to go out. That restricted amount fluctuates so greatly because of the projects and when they're paid. The unrestricted is really where we want to focus. And for the next 5 years, we believe we can get that to 10 million and give that balance, the necessary cushion, the necessary feel for how much debt we have outstanding.
Right. Okay. So for 2023, we haven't really worked out, we, the 5 of us, haven't really worked, or you're going to probably present at some time, a strategy, you said, on how to utilize those funds. The ballot said economic development, I believe infrastructure, and housing,
So
workforce housing.
Yeah, 70% was for public infrastructure and debt, 20% economic development, 10% workforce housing.
Okay, so 70%
Correct.
will go towards all of that then,
Yep.
okay. And it looks like most of the projects go on to your general bond from 2023 on. So it's going to be pretty hefty from there on.
Yep.
For all of those, so far, five projects. I'm glad you told us about the Marriott. So if the Marriott's property value has increased already to 17 million, does that mean the entire Aggieville district has also increased a much higher percentage than what it is now?
Yeah, I went building by building today just because Riley County populated their site, and I'm always curious where property values are. And a lot of them have grown at that 5 and 10% range, which, yes, will contribute to the TIF.
Okay, so that goes into the TIF one then, okay. my concern, I think, as we work on more plans with the ARPA funds and with the sales tax, and even with the EcoDevo funds that we have in the other boxes that we haven't been presented this evening, I'm concerned about new projects coming on, and that's always been my hesitancy. So I've been trying to be a little bit more assertive in the no part. So when we look at the art museum coming on board, I want to make sure that's completely funded by private entities. If there is a city component to it, we need to know a little bit ahead of time how much that's going to be. Same with Fuse. If they're going to do Fuse, that's great, but the thought process was it was also going to be privately funded, private investors. If there's a city component, we need to know, because typically that's in the millions of dollars. So those are the types of surprises, or some things that would go into temp bonds and eventually go into general bonds would concern me. And then there's this whole conversation about the aquatic center and all of that. So I just want to move on those a little bit more measured and thinking about the big picture, because we keep talking about these 5 projects. They're all going to kick in around 2023, 2025, and then our debt limit, we have 40 million left, is what we're saying.
Commissioner, in terms of that debt limit, those amounts are already factored into that because we've already issued a temporary note. So when they are converted to bonds, whatever we convert to bonds will adjust that amount in terms of what's remaining. And then when we pay off debt, that also adjusts our debt limit, as well as our evaluation. If that changes, that adjusts our debt limit calculation as well.
Okay, because 40 million is not a whole lot.
Correct.
So I just want to be sure by the time we agree to other projects coming on. And I think,
Commissioner, if I may,
Yeah.
I think you're hitting on a very good topic, and it's something we'll bring up again. In 2006 to about 2010, we issued a lot of debt in this community, downtown redevelopment, but we also had other things going on in the community. And it did stress us, and there were a lot of different revenue streams coming in. When we got to that point, we also did look at, you can't keep going at that pace. We can't keep going at the pace we've been going at. We know that. And it does require us to measure what it is we're doing against what we have capacity for and what we can afford. A lot of the approach in the coming years will have to factor this in, and Rena's right. Every conversation we have brings into the big 5 into the picture. Public Works, Park and Rec, Airport, we're all constantly talking about the debt. At least 4 times a year we get together and talk about it, where we're at, where we're headed. But, we haven't been in front of you to talk about this very often. We talk about it a lot, but it's not something we always share with you. With the downgrading and the capacity being where it's at, it's very much a topic we'd like to keep in front of you. That balance in that bond and interest fund, we just kind of keep coming back to it. It is the driver for a lot of the conversations. So I don't think we're disagreeing with where you're headed. It's an obvious thing that we absolutely need to continue to communicate about and strategize about. It's also was the driving force for that 0.5. Had we not been successful in that, we would have been back in front of you requesting to go back either for the sales tax or developing some mill levy strategy to get us there.
yeah, and I hope there are more grants that we can apply for, because I know there's lots of money that's being thrown out there. So I look forward to that. Some of the other challenges we have is, John mentioned at our retreat, the enrollment in Kansas State University is not going to increase anytime soon. So that's one thing, and I don't know about the deployments at Fort Riley. So these are 2 populations that continue to impact our sales tax. So I want to make sure that the collections are very realistic. I'm glad we're having a discussion about this. I think it's extremely important to recognize our debt, our responsibility, and what we can handle. And we still want to be successful. We still want to be optimistic and grow for Manhattan and the economy of Manhattan. But like I said, the challenge of the populations are concerning. And once we get the money in 2023, we also need to be part of that discussion that all of you are having as city staff about how to utilize those funds, because I don't know what the housing study is going to say. I'm eager to see it, and I don't know what the pay study looks like, because I do think we need to dedicate and be committed to our staff and salaries, and make sure we have all the resources necessary, especially in our IT department, everything that was brought before us, to make sure we are still moving forward and not losing staff one bit at a time. So I'm looking forward to more discussions about ARPA funds and seeing how that goes as well.
So from what I'm hearing, I mean, some of these numbers are a little ugly that we've gone through, but it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page as far as the plan goes, which is we have these ARPA funds. Sounds like whether we go the 10 million route for, revenue losses or document and things like the water fund, we have a way to work with that to get the funding where we need it to be. Then we have the increased sales tax that kicks in. I think we're on the same page saying we don't want to increase the mill levy. We do want to capture the money for new construction, as well as inflation, which now, inflation alone gets you up to 7%. You're talking about asking people for without any type of mill levy increase. But if we get that, I think we can take care of the big five, the ERP and the other systems, the stuff with the capital plan, the salaries and the staffing. But I think it has to be over a long-term plan. It's not a one-year deal. And that's where I come back to is hopefully we can see that over a number of years with a number of assumptions to see, how do we, grow these things as we shift this money around. And then if a new project comes up, it'll be real obvious. That just will probably blow that plan, and then we have to make a decision. So while, like I said, it looks kind of ugly there, I think we definitely have a way to see that light at the end of the tunnel. And just one minor thing, why did that alcohol tax go down? I thought the pandemic drove alcohol consumption way up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not
It's
packaged.
not a package. We don't collect the liquor tax on the packaged liquor store sales. It's liquor by the drink, and that was impacted.
And that went down because no one was going to the bars, no one was
Correct.
drinking at home. That's what did.
But the last
Yeah,
quarter,
because we shut the bars down for a period of time.
Yeah.
and Put other constraints on them that caused people not to go there. But I wanted to comment, Jason, you're talking about that, economic development tax, and of course, we won't have to bond this big five till, 27, 26? So is it possible to, since that money is dedicated to infrastructure, and we can't use it for anything else, the 70%, can't that be captured and just parked in the reserve, bonded interest reserve?
And that's where we were talking about these big five and creating project accounts. And I mean, it's not as if we're going to spend it. We're just going to reserve it to when the debt is
Exactly.
due.
And I think that's the way to go.
Yeah,
I'm in
and-
favor of that.
And the other strategy at the same time, Commissioner, is to bolster the fund balance in other ways. Take a 4 to 5 year approach. We believe we can get to 10 million by that 4 to 5 year approach and have these revenues from the sales tax ready to pay the debt service here.
Yeah. So you could fence it in here, but it would also count as being in the reserve at the same time, and then,
You could. We're going to try to keep it out of that and have a reserve strategy on its own.
I think that's good. And then the other thing is, we just don't need to be bonding any more big projects. I mean, until part of this five goes away. And there doesn't need to be any other big things unless it's some emergency, like the levee or something that's a disaster for the water department, but we just can't take on any more big projects. We're maxed out.
So just a small comment on that. Keep in mind and Rena, you might go back to your, what kind of debt counts towards your statutory debt limit, which is what that 40 million is. You can issue all of those exempt components, and you will have other utility issues before you coming in the next year with the utility master plan, but that doesn't count against our debt limit. The other thing that's been in our favor is this community has performed well as far as raising some of the revenue to do that. I'll give you the Star Bond District. We ended it early, 5 years early, 6 years early, so outperformed. we hope that local economy continues to churn that way so that that kind of performance happens. I mean, that's a really good success story and part of that 60 million in debt we issued with all of that. So those are the kind of things that as in North Campus Corridor, you all, every time we brought you a project in a phase, you've all just, kind of take a big gulp and say, well, I hope all of these sources come through. And we do too, and I think our performance has been that they have, and so we hope that continues. But if we do hit a big slide, that's when we need those reserves, so that if it doesn't happen. And then the other aspect is that your operating departments have cut significant expenses in order to make sure everything was okay. I mean, that's part of why it's taken us longer to dig out of the pandemic hole, because we hit a big hiring freeze and had 40 to 50 vacant positions. We still got 20 vacant positions full-time. So, and just when we hire 5, we lose 6. So it's hard to dig out of that hole in this kind of jobs market environment. But at the same time, we're trying to, and that was what we talked about at the retreat, the workload that we have relative to the folks we got to do that workload. So balancing all that's going to continue to be an important element. And then there's a lot of people that are working very hard and doing multiple jobs. So taking care of them is going to be important.
I just have one question before do you have an idea what is in the unspent personnel funds?
I do not. We can get that for you, though.
That would be great, thank you.
Jason, you brought up the fact that our general fund cash balance was good because of the $4 million in CARES money. What's the deal with that? Are there obligations for that, that it's just we haven't spent it yet, or that's free money for us to do with what we want?
It's unrestricted.
Yep.
And we would prefer it stay there to create that balance. It's money that obviously came early, and it was direct towards municipalities. We got it for documenting our fire services during that period of time in 2020. That's the money that went to the county, and we had to work with them on how it was distributed.
Oh,
Yeah, so it was a couple years ago.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
But that's not earmarked for something else.
they're all documented expenses, and that's part of our flexible money that we've talked about that has some ability to be able to do some of the expenditures that we need to do with the pay study implementation, some of those components that, again, what we're trying to do is come up with strategies that are sustainable. So as opposed to one-time expense money that we don't use for something that we need to sustain. So those are those strategies that we're developing to bring to you. But we have consistently underspent our budget on purpose in order to make sure that we've exceeded, that we haven't overextended ourselves. So,
Any obligation for that CARES money has been met?
yes.
Okay.
I'd like to make sure that we have some idea about the cost savings and the programs that will be affected by that you have in mind when you're working on the budget as a savings instead of, just so we know what's happening, not blindsided. I'd like to be sure too that we consider Riley County Police Department, and that the city and the county could share those costs, because just like the city had COVID issues and expenses, the county had them, RCPD had them too, and they have no revenue flow to make any of that up. So I think it behooves our city and our county to help. And that doesn't mean making them whole at our expense. It means that we take that into consideration in some way, so that they're not being punished. And every other, even the nonprofits got money from the federal government in PPP and other kinds of funds, but RCPD hasn't. And so I just want to make sure that we factor that in.
So that would be part of our overall consideration about whether you want to, it is a unique circumstance where normally they would be part of us or part of the county and
Yeah.
would have been part of those overall reimbursements that we could have claimed more CARES money for if there were more CARES money available. I guess I would just offer that we kept the police department whole by making a full transfer of the budget, where we cut our expenses on our side drastically. So our first priority is going to try to be to make ourselves whole because they haven't really lost any money. Now, they do have qualified expenses that they would be eligible for money if they had it,
Exactly.
but they don't have a hole like we do necessarily.
There's
I'm not aware of it.
There's
anyway. I can
balance
certainly
here.
talk
And
to
every
what they
other
might
police
have.
department around the country, because it is either a sheriff under a county or a police in a city, is getting access to some of this money. And I'm just saying that RCPD is entitled, and it's up to us to be, share those funds in some way. And I'm not saying whole, I'm just, we have to, and I don't necessarily consider it part of the community needs section, which is with all the nonprofits and others. I think it has a higher priority. They're one of our government units here.
I guess the only last question is, do we have some fears out there about interest rates? I mean, as we do these temp notes and the Fed's talking about doing some raising there. I know it's been in the news lately that muni bonds are off to a really bad start this year. And
I would like to hear from the Baker Tilly representative too. And I know you've channeled information to our staff and we're hearing it, but I would like to have the privilege of hearing your comments about our condition and our status.
So on the question about interest rates, I think it's important first to recognize that for over a decade, we've been sitting at near record lows. So whatever increases we're talking about today, at this point, still take us well below what I would say, are historically average municipal bond rates. So one thing I've been telling a lot of my clients is, it's important to stay calm and not overreact. Yes, rates might go up 50 basis points, 100 basis points, but they're still a heck of a lot lower than they were 20 years ago. And project affordability isn't impacted that greatly. So there's no real reason to panic. As you heard said earlier, you've been planning at a 4% rate. Well, at this point, we're nowhere close to that. So if your model can afford 4%, you're sitting in good shape. But yes, I think we are seeing probably a period, maybe the end of this prolonged, incredibly low interest rate environment into something that's, a little bit more elevated. It would, certainly with inflation ticking up, which has really been, that's been the main factor that's, without any real notable inflation, the Fed hasn't had any real reason to raise rates, and we've kept rates relatively low. But in the near term, it's hard to say. I mean, this issue, what's going on right now in the Ukraine, typically in times of war, there's a rush to safety, and municipal bonds are very, very popular during those periods of time, which would drive rates back down again. So we'll certainly watch it, but again, want to emphasize that your staff has been very wise in their fiscal planning and has used very conservative assumptions, and even with the elevated rates, still sounds like it's well within your plans. With regards to any other comments, I'd be happy to respond to questions. I'm not really quite sure what it is that you're hoping I would address.
To repeat, I think Mark asked, if we were to be downgraded again, we would go to this A1 status?
Right.
All right. And the interest rate on that would be run about what?
Well, it varies from time to time. Let's say there is a substantive difference between being in the AA category and being in the single A category. So from a standpoint of, saving money on interest, it does behoove you to try to stay in the AA category. You as a community are entering a very important period of time. You have the big 5 projects. We've heard that a lot tonight, right? I mean, these are transformational projects for your community. And progressive communities that, progressive, and I use that in the term of forward-thinking communities, will go through these periods of making those sort of transformational investments. And invariably, they put stresses on the financials. I always say that with the rating agencies, having challenges does not necessarily result in a rating downgrade. Having challenges and not having a plan on how you're going to address those challenges, that will get you downgraded. The rating agencies abhor a vacuum. And so the important thing, and Jason, and Ron have talked about a plan yet tonight, and I think it's going to get, the details of that are going to get filled in as you go into the budget process. But that's going to be the important thing. With this period of making these transformational investments, which I think we all believe will pay dividends over the long term for your community, the important thing is going to be having a plan for how you're going to deal with that elevated period of debt associated with it.
I read in the Wall Street Journal today that the interest rates are expected to go up 0.5% next week. So there are changes coming, and I think we do have to be mindful, I guess, about changes in the future. But we got here by not doing something. So, and that if that's planning, if that's then we're changing our MO.
Well, as I said, I mean, your plan accounted for higher rates, so you're in good shape there. And we have a little bit of the yin and the yang, right? I mean, we're entering a period where it seems that rates are going to go up.
Yep.
At the same time, you haven't been able to invest idle funds and make any money on it in a long, long time. And we are now entering a period where you, once again, are going to be able to invest your idle funds and actually make a decent return on them. So you'll have that going for you. We also are entering a period, and it was alluded to earlier, where property values are going up. So while, yes, maybe interest rates are going up, and that's certainly not a happy thing, but we're seeing other positive developments in other areas. So, as I say, I think as we enter this period, we've been sitting in this just incredibly low interest rate environment for so long, and I think it's human nature to say, oh my goodness, interest rates are going up. But on the balance, at this point, the change is not going to be that significant, at least what we're seeing right now. I can't predict the future with any great certainty, but at least what we're seeing right now, based on market fundamentals, yeah, we're seeing 50 basis points, maybe 100 basis points. But even then, that gets us that's still on the low side of where municipal bond rates have been historically.
Tom, you may want to elaborate just a touch. Debt's a funny thing. Debt you issued 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you probably had the opportunity to refinance. And that savings then helps you in your bond and interest with current debt. It's the same that we're going to experience. We obviously issued debt for about a decade at a very low rate, and as it trickles back up, we'll lose the opportunity to refinance that debt in that 10-year period. So if we issue at a higher rate for the next 10, it'll cycle back in 10 more years after that. it's one of those things that I do think if you take the 40-year view, it all kind of evens out. So as we see the rates go up, historically, they've come back down. And it's opportunities for us to look at that debt, make sure we structure it appropriately so we can call it and reissue. But even yesterday, we were talking with Rena about there's a part of our bond and interest that actually sees savings from past issues that helps with your balance. So yes, the rates can have an impact, but they can also swing the other way and help you in other ways you would have never thought of 20 years ago, debt being issued, and now you got savings.
I'd just like to say that we are proud of our community. We're proud that we have these projects, quite frankly. A lot of communities have lost population and business and lost business and industry, and we have been successful in attracting and so we aren't on a downhill track at all, and that's a really positive thing for all of us. So it's encouraging.
I totally agree. I mean, I'm approaching now 40 years in working in local government, so I've got a little bit of time now to look back, and you know, one thing I've seen consistently over my career is those communities who have invested in the quality of quality of life of their communities. They've seen dividends come from those investments.
Well, the problem is that these once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime projects are all happening at the same time. Instead, the levee, we haven't done anything for 70 years, almost 60, 70 years on levee. We haven't had to do anything with the airport for 40-some years. And the Kimball Avenue, like you said, 20 years ago, it was a 2-lane county-maintained road, and now it's going to be a beautiful parkway type of a thing, so which we'll never have to do for another 30 years. And so, it's just it's accumulation all at the same time is just the thing that makes the big challenge. But the nice thing is we've got lots of different income sources identified. If everything pans out like it's supposed to, it's like, this was a great idea, and if things go off the rails and some things start tanking, then we'll have to make some changes as best we can. But I think it's all gonna. The commission's job is to have some forward vision and to not. I always talk about the 10,000-foot view. I don't care about day-to-day piddly stuff. Our goal is to focus on the long term, make this thing work for the long haul. And while we do have to do yearly budgets and make things work on a regular basis, I think we should still be in good shape as we kind of move forward. We've got some flexibility, we've got a little bit of time, and I would really expect, for the most part, our local economy to continue to improve. Inflation makes things cost more, but we get more sales tax, but then it costs us more to operate business of the city because supplies and everything go up just as much or more than what everything else does. But looking forward to seeing the plan and figure out what the strategy is, and then we can discuss things a lot more.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think listening to you made me feel a little bit more calm than before you came up, not because of what I was hearing from our staff or from Rena or anybody else, but you have that perspective from your experience in other municipalities and what you're seeing everywhere else, and as far as the financial institutions and what they look for in grading units such as ours. But we do have dedicated revenue sources, so hopefully that happens. Our sales tax has declined the past few years, so hopefully all of these will impact it enough that we can collect those sales tax. I think property tax has always been there. And unfunded mandates from legislators also sometimes impact what we do. And then the supply chains and all of the labor costs have gone up. But I think as we discuss the ARPA funds and everything else, we can probably work on that plan a little bit more. What I have been always satisfied is with any commissioner that I've worked with, we've always approved projects because it is better for our community. And I think there hasn't been that much resistance in that area as far as projects. I think we will move a little bit more cautiously because we have so much on our table right now. But I think this gives us a holistic perspective, and hopefully we do have more discussions. This is the biggest, this is the most comprehensive picture I've seen in a long time, and I think it was very important to see that.
I would just would add, it has, I'm surprised it hasn't come up, and I have a feeling it's going to come up soon. We haven't talked about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and there is a lot of money, and I'm guessing you guys are already working to see what,
Yes.
if any of those big five can be augmented with the
Right.
Infrastructure Act, which I would think they possibly could.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is Dick Carter been saying anything? Is there anything happening in Topeka about getting us our LAVTR money, even a fourth of it or something? If they could just commit to 1%, it'd be impossible to get them to honor the state law and the obligations they're supposed to have. But is there any talk that might be one way they're going to?
I haven't seen it on the horizon. I know it is part of the league platform, and they've been advocating for it. It's in our platform. I don't know if it'll rise above the bar. I mean, they've been talking about a lot of other things. With the reduction of the sales tax revenue on food, which looks like it's going to happen, they're just now debating how soon it's going to happen. Those kind of things will be more difficult. But clearly the state revenue picture is better than it's been in a long time, so they might have some of those options. But as of right now, I'm not aware of any bills that have arisen to the occasion. But that's one we're watching for sure. At the same time, the state has come out with a lot of they got a pretty big ARPA check too. And so they are working hard to make some of those funds available for local units of government and private and nonprofits all. So there's a number of different ones. Those seem to have, we're working on one that had about a less than a month deadline to turn it around. Those are the ones that are more difficult when you're short of staff and trying to figure out how to approach it. So several of us are in a lot of webinars to try and learn a lot of that. And there's the infrastructure one's a good example. I mean, just one federal department has like 10 webinars on different subjects in different areas already scheduled over the next month. And my concern is that they're so preoccupied with this extra money that they forget about their regular programs. So just in our airport, I mean, the other thing that's hurting us is we don't have a federal appropriations budget. We have another continuing resolutions till March. So FAA is not going to give us that grant until they get the appropriations bill done. So it delays that project from even moving forward, which may have an impact on that DOD grant that's supposed to be spent by a certain time. So it just gets kind of crazy keeping all that straight. But the good news is there is a lot of federal and state money out there, and we're going to try and leverage it as much as we can, absolutely.
Mayor, if there aren't any other questions for me, I'm going to go ahead and sit down and turn this back over to your staff.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate your being here. Rena?
That concludes our presentation. If
Okay.
there's no other questions from you all.
Are there other questions, other comments? We appreciate this presentation. It's been helpful in understanding the whole that we need to. And we just have to watch the projects that pop up on the radar out of nowhere that aren't in the budget. And those are tricky, and they do happen. So thank you all. Thanks for being here. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.